My father had been gone for less than 48 hours when my sister-in-law leaned toward me and whispered, "So, we should talk about the money." We were still dressed in black. The office flowers hadn't even wilted yet. Around us, coworkers spoke in hushed voices, sharing memories of the man who built an $800 million company from the ground up. Some of them had cried at the funeral, some were still crying now, but Emily wasn't mourning. She was calculating. She smiled like this was a casual family discussion, like my father's death had simply cleared a scheduling conflict. "Daniel will take over," she said softly. "It's what everyone expects." I nodded. I said nothing, because arguing would have warned her. And what Emily didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that my father had already decided who would own everything, long before she ever made her move. The funeral ended the way funerals always do, slowly, painfully, and without answers. People lingered. No one wanted to be the first to leave. My father had been more than a CEO to them. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, who showed up at warehouses at dawn, who knew the names of people others called replaceable. I stood near the back, hands folded, listening as coworkers shared quiet memories. He saved my job during the recession. He paid for my daughter's surgery. He believed in me when no one else did. Then I noticed Emily. She wasn't listening. She was scanning the room. Her eyes moved from face-to-face board members, department heads, regional directors, like she was mentally sorting who mattered and who didn't. Every few seconds, she leaned in to whisper something to my brother, Daniel. He nodded. A lot. When people approached him with condolences, he didn't say, "Thank you." He said, "I'll take good care of things." That word "things" landed wrong. After the service, as the crowd slowly shifted toward the reception hall, Emily finally approached me. She wrapped her arms around me in a hug that felt carefully measured, like a public performance. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you," she said. Her voice was soft, sympathetic, perfect. "Thank you," I replied. She pulled back just enough to look at my face. Her eyes sharpened. "Daniel's going to have so much on his shoulders now," she continued. "The company, the legacy, all that responsibility." I waited. She smiled. "But it's good that everything is already structured." I felt my chest tighten. "Structured how?" She waved a hand casually. "You know, succession, control, stability. People need to feel reassured." Reassured. My father had been gone for 2 days, and she was already managing optics. Across the room, I saw Mark, our head of operations, watching the interaction closely. When our eyes met, he raised an eyebrow slightly, just enough to say, "I see it too." Emily followed my gaze and laughed lightly. "Oh, don't worry. Everyone will be taken care of." Then she lowered her voice. "Of course, not everyone needs to stay involved at the same level." There it was, the unspoken line. I took a slow breath. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head, studying me like a puzzle she'd already solved. "You've always been so good behind the scenes," she said. "Details, organization, support roles." Support roles. Daniel finally spoke up. "Emily just means you don't have to stress anymore, Sarah. You've done enough." I looked at my brother, really looked at him. His black suit was tailored perfectly, his posture confident. But his eyes kept darting toward Emily, as if waiting for cues. "I'm not stressed," I said evenly. Emily's smile tightened. "That's good. Because things will move fast now." She gestured toward a small group of executives standing near the windows. "We're having a private meeting tomorrow morning. Just family and leadership." "Family," I repeated. She nodded. "Of course." But her tone made it clear, she didn't mean me. As she turned away, Mark approached. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know today must be overwhelming." "It is," I replied. He hesitated, then leaned closer. "For what it's worth, people are noticing." I glanced back at Emily, now laughing softly as she whispered something to one of the board members. "I hope so," I said. Because what they were seeing wasn't grief. It was ambition, raw, impatient, and already reaching for things that didn't belong to it. And this time, I wasn't going to pretend not to notice. I didn't always plan to stay quiet. In the early years, I spoke up. I offered ideas in meetings. I corrected mistakes before they became disasters. But every time I did, someone smiled politely and said, "Let Daniel handle that." So I learned. I learned that if I solved problems silently, they stayed solved. If I waited for credit, nothing moved. While Daniel traveled to conferences and posed for photos, I sat in windowless rooms, negotiating contracts no one wanted to touch. When suppliers threatened to walk, I talked them down. When regulators asked questions, I answered them carefully, completely, legally. No applause, no spotlight, just results. My father noticed, even if he never said it out loud. Late nights were when he trusted me most. He would call after everyone else had gone home. "Tell me the real numbers," he'd say. And I would. Not the polished version. Not the one prepared for shareholders. The truth. Sometimes he would sigh and say, "I don't know what I'd do without you." I held on to those words longer than I should have, because outside his office, the narrative was different. Emily once laughed during a company dinner and said, "Sarah's the one who keeps everything tidy." I'd fall apart without her spreadsheets. People chuckled. I smiled. Daniel never corrected her. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Titles were temporary. Impact was permanent. I believed that if I kept the company safe, the company would keep me safe too. That belief cracked the morning after the funeral. I arrived early, like always. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier after loss. I poured myself coffee and opened my inbox. There were emails I hadn't been copied on. Calendar invites marked private. Documents flagged executive only. I scrolled, my stomach tightening. When Daniel and Emily arrived, they walked past my desk like I wasn't there. "Morning," I said. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Hey." Emily didn't even look at me. I followed them into the conference room anyway. I took my usual seat, opened my notebook, and waited. Emily cleared her throat. "Before we begin," she said, "we've decided to streamline communication during this transition." She slid a printed list across the table. Names, departments, access levels. My name was there, but lower than it had ever been. "Support functions will report upward," she continued. "This will help reduce confusion." Reduce confusion. I raised my hand slightly. "Is legal aware of these changes?" Emily smiled without warmth. "They will be." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Sarah, you don't have to worry about this stuff anymore." I looked at him. "This is my stuff." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Emily leaned forward. "You've done great work," she said slowly, like explaining something to a child. "But leadership needs vision, presence, confidence, confidence." The room felt smaller, warmer, like the air had been quietly rearranged without my consent. I nodded once. "If that's how you want to proceed." Emily exhaled, relieved. "I knew you'd understand." But what she mistook for understanding was calculation. That afternoon, Mark stopped by my office again. He didn't sit. "They're locking people out," he said. "Finance, legal, even it." I closed my laptop. "Then they're moving faster than I thought. Should we be worried?" I thought of my father, of his late-night calls, of the envelope he'd pressed into my hand years ago and told me never to open unless I had to. "Yes," I said quietly, "but not for the reason they think." Because while Emily was busy rearranging chairs, she hadn't realized something fundamental. She was standing on a foundation she didn't understand. And foundations don't collapse loudly at first. They crack, slowly, then all at once. By the end of that week, the company felt unfamiliar. Not broken, not chaotic, just off. Doors that were always open were suddenly closed. Meetings happened behind tinted glass. People lowered their voices when Emily walked past, then looked down at their screens like nothing had happened. Daniel and Emily had moved into my father's office. They hadn't changed anything yet. That came later. For now, it was the symbolism that mattered. Emily sat behind his desk like it had been waiting for her. "This will only be temporary," she said during the first executive briefing. "Until everything is finalized." Finalized. She spoke like the outcome was already decided. Mark sat across from her, jaw tight. "Finalized according to which process?" Emily smiled. "Let's not get lost in procedures. Everyone knows Daniel is the natural successor." Natural. That word echoed in my head. I glanced around the room. A few people nodded, out of habit more than conviction. Others stayed perfectly still. "I'd like to see the transition plan," said Laura, our head of compliance. "Specifically how authority is being transferred." Emily's fingers paused mid-tap on the table. "We're handling that internally," she replied. Laura didn't back down. "With respect, that's not how governance works." Daniel shifted in his seat. Do we really need to slow things down with red tape? Laura met his eyes. Red tape is what keeps this company out of court. The room went quiet. Emily laughed softly. Let's stay positive. Senate's not of the misers Andrews have said. But positivity couldn't cover the tension anymore. Later that day, an internal memo went out announcing temporary leadership realignment. No signatures, no legal citations, just language designed to sound official. My phone buzzed nonstop. Did you see this? Is this approved? Are they allowed to do this? I answered carefully. I'm reviewing. That night, I stayed late. So did half the building. Mark appeared in my doorway around 9. They froze a vendor payment, he said. A big one. No explanation. That contract has penalties, I replied. Severe ones. I know. I closed my eyes. They're testing limits. Whose? Everyone's. The next morning, Emily called an all-hands meeting. She stood in front of the auditorium with Daniel beside her, smiling like this was a celebration. Change can be uncomfortable, she said, but it's necessary. Someone in the back muttered, so is transparency. Emily ignored it. We ask for your trust during this transition, she continued. There's no need for speculation. That was when Mark stood up. With respect, he said evenly. People aren't speculating. They're concerned. Emily's smile faltered. Concerned about what? She asked. About legality, Laura added from the side aisle. About stability. About whether this company is being protected or rushed. A ripple moved through the room. Heads nodded. Eyes lifted. Daniel stepped forward. This isn't the time for doubt. Mark didn't sit down. Then it's the time for answers. Emily's face hardened. We're family, she said sharply. This doesn't need to be a debate. I finally stood. It does, when family decisions affect thousands of employees. Every eye turned to me. Emily stared, stunned. I didn't realize you were speaking for the company now. I kept my voice calm. I'm speaking for the structure your husband inherited and is now ignoring. The room held its breath. For the first time since my father's death, Emily looked uncertain. Not afraid, but aware. That afternoon, legal requested a formal review. Finance refused to release funds without documentation. IT quietly restored access Emily had tried to revoke. Nothing dramatic. No shouting. No chaos. Just resistance. That evening, Mark sent me a single message. If you have something, now would be the time. I looked at the locked drawer in my desk, at the envelope inside, at my father's handwriting. Only open if they crossed the line. They had crossed it. And tomorrow, I was going to stop pretending I didn't see it. I waited until the building was almost empty. The lights on my floor were dimmed automatically after 7, but my office stayed lit. I locked the door, pulled the drawer open, and took out the envelope I had promised myself I would never need. My father's handwriting was steady, precise. If you're reading this, it means they stopped listening. I sat down. Inside were folders organized, labeled, impossible to misinterpret. Trust agreements, loan records, board contingencies. Not emotional words, not personal grievances, just facts. Page after page showed a pattern that made my chest tighten. Every emergency fund Daniel had received, every temporary advance Emily had framed as support, all of it categorized the same way. Debt, not gifts, not inheritance, liabilities. And then I saw the clause my father had underlined in blue ink. In the event that total personal liability exceeds the threshold, all associated voting rights and succession privileges are suspended until settlement. Suspended. Not delayed. Not negotiated. Gone. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since the funeral, I let myself feel it: grief, anger, relief, all tangled together. My father hadn't been naive. He had been patient. The next morning, Emily called me into her office. She didn't invite me to sit. We need to talk about your role, she said, folding her arms. You've been disruptive. I nodded. I've been careful, she scoffed. You're encouraging doubt. That's dangerous in a transition. What's dangerous, I replied evenly, is bypassing governance. Her eyes flashed. Daniel is the heir. He's the son, I corrected. Those aren't the same thing. She stepped closer. You think you're smarter than us? I met her gaze. No, I think my father was. Her smile vanished. Be very careful, she said. You don't want to isolate yourself. I thought of the coworkers who had quietly pushed back, of Mark refusing to release funds, of legal reopening files. I'm not isolated, I said. I'm aligned. She dismissed me with a sharp gesture. We'll discuss this later. But later never came the way she expected. By noon, compliance had issued a formal inquiry. Finance flagged inconsistencies. Legal requested documentation Emily couldn't produce. The company didn't panic. It paused. That afternoon, Daniel cornered me near the elevators. What are you doing? He hissed. I'm protecting the company, I replied. You're undermining me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something painful. He didn't feel betrayed. He felt exposed. This doesn't have to be a fight, he said quietly. We're family. I held his gaze. Then start acting like it. The elevator doors opened. He didn't step inside. By the end of the day, the board scheduled an emergency session for Monday morning. Emily called it a misunderstanding. Legal called it a review. Mark called me after hours. People are ready, he said. They just needed proof. I closed my laptop slowly. They'll get it, I replied. Because once those documents were on the table, this wouldn't be about ambition or grief anymore. It would be about accountability. And accountability doesn't care who you married or whose name you share. The boardroom had never felt so small. Monday morning, 8 a.m. Sharp. Every seat was filled. Some people stood along the walls, pretending they were only there to observe. No one spoke above a whisper. Coffee cups sat untouched. Emily entered first. She wore white, crisp, confident. Like this was a ceremony meant to crown her, not question her. Daniel followed, jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. Emily smiled as she took her seat at the head of the table. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she said smoothly. I know emotions are still high, but it's important we move forward with clarity and unity. Unity. She nodded toward the screen behind her. We'll begin by formalizing interim leadership so we can reassure our partners. Mark didn't sit. Before we do that, he said calmly, there are unresolved legal matters. Emily's smile thinned. We've already addressed those. Laura adjusted her glasses. No, you haven't. A murmur rippled through the room. Emily folded her hands. With respect, this meeting is about succession, not hypotheticals. That depends, I said quietly, on whether succession is still valid. Every head turned. Emily's eyes locked onto mine. Sarah, she said carefully, this is not the time. It's exactly the time. I stood. My legs felt steady, even if my chest didn't. For the last week, I continued, decisions have been made without authorization, funds frozen without cause, governance protocols ignored. Daniel leaned forward. You're exaggerating. I met his gaze. I'm documenting. I clicked the remote. The first document appeared. Loan agreement. Daniel Harper. Emily frowned. What is that? Support? She said automatically. Family support. I shook my head. Debt. The word landed hard. Laura leaned closer to the screen. This is binding. Emily stood abruptly. This is internal family business. Mark spoke before I could. No, this is corporate liability. More pages followed. Dates, amounts, signatures. Emily's voice sharpened. You're twisting things. I kept going. Clause 14, I said. Voting rights suspended once liability exceeds threshold. Silence. Daniel's face drained of color. That's not... You signed it, Laura said softly. Multiple times. The room felt heavy. Like oxygen had been removed without warning. Emily laughed once short, strained. You expect us to believe this was planned? Yes, I said. Her eyes burned. So, this is your play? You waited until he was gone? I felt something break open in my chest, not rage, but resolve. No, I replied. He waited until you showed him who you were. Mark exhaled slowly. According to these records, the threshold was exceeded months ago. One of the regional directors spoke up, voice shaking. So, authority never transferred? Laura nodded. Correct. Emily looked around the room, searching for support. She found none. Daniel finally spoke, barely audible. What does this mean? I swallowed. It means leadership hasn't been yours, I said. Not legally, not ethically. The room erupted not in shouting but in motion. Papers shuffled, people whispered, phones buzzed. Emily sank back into her chair. For the first time, she looked small. And for the first time since my father died, I felt the weight shift slowly, undeniably away from them. The crown hadn't been stolen. It had never belonged to them at all. No one spoke for several seconds, not because they didn't know what to say, but because everyone understood exactly what had just happened. The illusion was gone. Emily was the first to move. She stood so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous," she said, voice tight but controlled. "You're ambushing us with paperwork while we're grieving." Grieving. The word felt misplaced, like a costume worn too late. Laura didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This isn't an ambush. These documents were signed over several years. They're valid." Emily turned to Daniel. "Say something." He opened his mouth, closed it. His hands were shaking now, resting flat on the table as if to keep himself steady. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I didn't read the fine print." Mark let out a slow breath. "That's not a defense." A few people nodded, not dramatically, just once. Enough. Emily looked around the room again, this time more urgently. "You're really going to let her do this?" she asked, gesturing toward me. "She's always been behind the scenes. She doesn't represent this company." "That did it," someone in the back spoke up. "She represents stability." Another voice followed. "She's the reason our contracts survived last year. And the audits," someone else added. "She fixed those." Emily's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected confusion, maybe hesitation, not consensus. I stayed standing, though my legs had started to ache. "I never wanted this to be public," I said, "but decisions were being made that put people's jobs and the company's future at risk." Daniel finally looked at me, really looked at me. "You could have warned us." "I did," I replied quietly. "You didn't listen." Laura cleared her throat. "The board needs to determine next steps." Emily straightened, grasping at control. "Yes, exactly. Let's vote." A murmur moved through the room again. Mark shook his head. "There's nothing to vote on until authority is clarified." Laura nodded. "Under the trust structure, interim control defaults to the party who satisfies outstanding liabilities. Age in the sayings of the nastated Beitners. Heaven ever buys first for bees. It is firsted buys brops. In this fasted, in the daxus." Every eye turned to me. Emily's voice cracked not loud, just sharp. "You paid it?" I didn't smile. "Yes." Daniel pushed back his chair and stood, pacing a few steps before stopping. "So that's it? After everything, after all these years, you just take it?" The room held its breath. "I didn't take anything," I said. "I protected what was already here." Silence. Then Laura spoke the words that shifted everything. "Effective immediately, Daniel's voting rights are suspended pending review." Emily spun toward her. "You can't do that." Laura met her gaze steadily. "I can, and I have." Mark checked his tablet. "Finance is already aligning access accordingly." One by one, people began to move. Phones out, notes taken, systems adjusted. No applause, no celebration, just momentum. Emily sank back into her chair slowly, like the strength had drained from her all at once. She looked at Daniel, searching for reassurance. He had none to give. "This isn't over," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. I met her eyes across the table. "You're right," I said gently, "but it's no longer yours to decide." The meeting adjourned without ceremony. As people filed out, several paused near me not to congratulate, but to nod, to say, quietly, "Thank you." When the room finally emptied, Mark stayed behind. He looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. "You okay?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "I think so." He nodded once. "Your father trusted the right person." I stared at the documents still glowing on the screen. For the first time since my father died, I didn't feel like I was bracing for impact. The impact had already happened. And the company was still standing. The fallout wasn't loud. It was quiet, methodical, almost surgical. By the afternoon, access cards were updated. Legal notices were drafted. Finance restored frozen payments carefully, transparently, by the book. The company didn't spiral. It stabilized. Emily didn't come back to the office. Daniel did, but he stayed in the hallway, pacing, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and strained. When he finally saw me, he stopped. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Not now. Not please. Just talk." We stepped into an empty conference room. The glass walls felt exposed, like nothing was private anymore. "I didn't know," he said again. "About the loans, about the clauses." I folded my arms not defensively, just to ground myself. "You signed them." "I trusted Dad." "So did I." He looked away. "Emily says this is a betrayal." I held his gaze. Emily thought control was automatic. He exhaled sharply. "She's furious." "I know. She says you planned this for years." I shook my head. "No. I planned for the company to survive." Daniel sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. Smaller. "What happens now?" he asked. "The review continues," I replied. "Legal will decide next steps. You'll have representation. Everything will be handled properly." He flinched at the word properly. "So that's it?" he said quietly. "I lose everything?" I softened my voice but not my answer. "You lose control, not dignity. That part is still yours to keep." He didn't respond. Later that evening, Mark stopped by my office one last time. "HR has questions," he said. "So does legal. But," he paused, "people are relieved." "Relieved?" I repeated. He nodded. "They were scared to say anything. Now they feel protected." Protected. That word settled into me differently than power ever had. As I packed up to leave, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "This isn't over. You embarrassed us." I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded it to legal. When I finally walked out of the building, the sun was setting behind the skyline. The lights inside the offices flickered on steady, normal, unchanged. The company was still breathing. Emily had wanted a throne. Daniel had expected a crown. What they hadn't understood was this. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It holds the structure together when everything else is trying to fall apart. And tomorrow, I would finish what my father started, not with anger, not with revenge, but with responsibility. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. No headlines. No public spectacle. Just work. The board finalized an interim structure. Legal completed its review. Independent auditors confirmed what the documents already showed. Everything moved slowly, carefully, the way my father had always insisted it should. One afternoon, I stood in his old office alone. The desk was still there, scratched, solid, unimpressive by modern standards. I ran my fingers along the edge and thought about all the nights he'd stayed late, choosing responsibility over comfort. He hadn't left me money. He'd left me instructions. Mark knocked softly before entering. "Staff meeting in 10 minutes, he said. "They want to hear from you." I hesitated. "They don't need speeches." He smiled slightly. "They need reassurance." So I stood in front of them, engineers, accountants, managers, people who had built their lives around this company, and I told them the truth. That this place matters, that their work matters, and that no one would be pushed aside quietly ever again. When I finished, there was no applause. Just relief. Later that night, as I locked up, I checked my phone one last time. A notification flashed briefly. Emily had filed legal challenges that went nowhere. Daniel had stepped back entirely. I felt no triumph, only clarity. Because leadership, I learned, isn't about winning. It's about carrying weight without dropping it. My father didn't give me an empire. He gave me the responsibility to protect one. And this time I was ready to hold it openly, legally, and without apology.